Okay. Right. And I would like to start live streaming now. Wait a minute. Right. Okay. No. I chose the wrong platform. Twitch. I'm not there. I'm just on Facebook. All right. So I am choosing Facebook right now. And let's start. Right. Okay. Now I'm mute because I don't want to hear myself, the doubled voice. Okay, just give me a few seconds. Just a few. The doubled voice. Yeah. Okay, now I heard the doubled voice. Okay, Rob, nice to see you too. It's so nice to have you with us.
Hi, Rob.
Great. We are in great company. Okay, I would like to do one thing which I am not normally I don't do. Yes, but I would like, wait a minute, I would like to share my screen exceptionally because I have photos, 2 photos, very meaningful photos from this plenary lecture at IATEFL at IATEF conference. Yes, so I would like to show it. Just a moment. Just give me a moment so that I can share it. Right, here we go. Let's stretch it. Right, share the screen. Here we go. And then I will eliminate this function. Yes, so as you see, this is you in action. Yes, that is your body language tells us everything about you. So whoever would like to go to this website, I will provide you with a link in the chat box. Keep letting people in, Evan, as I move through the content. So you presented yourself in the following way: as a freelance English language teaching professional, specializing in business English and English for specific purposes, based in Germany, and then you enumerated the whole range of areas of interest. So I am not going to go through them. And your education. You have also mentioned that you have LinkedIn profile, so we would be able to link with you on your LinkedIn profile. And 4 main areas of expertise: multinational companies, materials writing, over 20 books already. Let's see how many more will appear on the horizon, and teacher training, and also intercultural and communication training. So I would like to encourage everybody to go to your website. And here is the bio provided by you, but I am not going to talk about it right now. I would just like to mention your previous webinar, Business English. Where are we now? Very, very important topic for all of us. And now I'm moving on to something that I find really important and inspiring. Katrin Lichterfeld, who is life and leadership coach, solution focus practitioner, and so on, wrote about you as a plenary speaker at the most recent conference, IATEFL conference, the following words, and let me quote them. "We are proud to have Evan Frendo as plenary speaker, delivering the first ever ESP and Business English at an IATEFL conference. And the topic was English for the workplace, looking for new answers." So now let me visualize it for all of us participating. This is Evan in action, yes? So here we have Evan's perspective. One more about being very optimistic to be in front of the crowd, the real crowd. Now let me show you the other perspective. So where it all takes place. Yes, you can see the huge room and Evan standing in front of a crowd of people and inspiring us with the perspectives that we are all going to encounter while doing what we are doing. And last but not least, for the dessert, I have another quote. Evan, in one of your emails to me, you wrote, as you know, I'm a member of IATEFL Poland. So perhaps you could introduce me. When you introduce me, you can say that an IATEFL Poland member did the opening plenary at the IATEFL conference. Thank you very much for saying this. We are proud to have you as one of our members. So, by the way, there is a link to the video from your plenary session, and I will also provide it in the chat box. So over to you. I will stop sharing. Yes, here we go. Now you can start sharing your slides with us.
Thank you very much, Lucina. Wow, what an introduction.
What a pleasure for me.
I hope I don't disappoint you. One of the things you should be aware about this talk is that it's basically a repeat of the same talk I did at IATEFL Poland conference last year. And the problem, as in all face-to-face conferences, there are so many sessions going on at the same time. And so Lucina thought it would be a good idea to give people an opportunity to see this. So if you were there, and you think, well, I don't need to learn any more about Belth, then that's fine. Thank you very much. But I'm hoping for most of you, this is a new talk. It'll be up on the YouTube video, YouTube site anyway. IETFL Poland has a very healthy website full of videos from these webinars, so to be there for forever, I guess. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about is something called Belth, English as a Business Lingua Franca. It used to be called Business English as a Lingua Franca, Belth, but nowadays we call it English as a Business Lingua Franca. And what I want to do really is just talk about what it is. A lot of us have heard the term, a lot of us haven't heard the term. But what I want to do is show why it's so important for anybody really teaching business English, teaching ESB, because the research that's going on, and there's so much work being done in this area, that it's really important, I think, for teachers just to be aware of it, to learn from it, to perhaps take some of the insights into their own everyday practice. So without further ado, here we go. Now, this is interesting because a few years ago at a BSIG conference, at an IETFL BSIG conference, I did a very similar talk, and I was looking at these articles. So this was in 2016, and it was exactly the same talk, current research up to 2016. So what had happened in the previous couple of years before then. Things have moved on, things have changed. There's been a lot of new insights, a lot of new detail. And that's really what I'm talking about today. I'm going to, first of all, introduce the idea of Belth and talk a little bit about it, give you some examples from my own practice as a maritime English teacher. And then I'm going to look at some very recent articles and just give everybody a feel for what people are looking at in this area. So if you want the old slides, they're on my website. You can just go in and download them and have a look. I'm not going to be talking about any of those articles from 2016 and previously. Everything is more modern than that, or more up to date. So let's start first of all by talking about English for specific purposes and Belth, and try and discuss this idea, or try and ask, where are we now? What do we mean by ESP? What do we mean by Belth? And then we're going to be looking at research and looking at implications. So let's start with this by Jong, who wrote a very interesting article a couple of years ago about global English in the workplace, introducing workplace English as a lingua franca. So she calls it wealth, not Belth. There is a relationship here. But what she started off by saying is something which I think a lot of us as teachers can recognize. She says, when I think of my own students, this is in Sweden, many of the students start with strong convictions about correct English. What is correct English? And sometimes students come from school, they've got quite a traditionalist mindset. And these traditionalist mindsets are things like, we require native speaker language skills if we want to be good at English. Native speakers own the language, so the English people of the world, or the Americans, decide what is right and what is wrong. And then when we look at culture, what we're talking about is the national cultures of these so-called native speakers. This is exactly where Belth is not. This is a more traditional way of thinking about it. We are moving away from words like native speaker completely. We are moving away from the idea that England has anything to do with English, and in fact, most people who speak English have nothing to do with England or America. It's a global language now. If we move on to English for specific purposes, there's a lot of work being done on this. Of course, it's been going strong now since the 60s. This was a very influential book in the 80s, Hutchinson and Waters. I'm sure if you're into ESP, you've come across it or at least heard the names. And what they talk about is ESP is not a thing where you can say English for something or English for something else and define it as a language product. But it's more of an approach, a way of thinking about how to teach English. It's about a mindset. And the mindset is very much everything goes according to why people are learning the language. So you start from that needs analysis. You start from why are the students there? You don't start because you've got a curriculum. You don't start because somebody has said you've got to pass a test. You start because of the students and what they want to do. Now, there is a problem with ESP. I mean, it sounds very easy, you know, you do a needs analysis and so on. But as Diane Belcher wrote, and I mean, lots of people have said exactly the same thing. It seems a good enough idea, you know, let's focus on the learner, simple. But how to do it in practice is actually quite challenging. And when you go into universities all over the world, when you speak to people teaching ESP in companies all over the world, you find that there are challenges. And this is something which we will be talking about. But as I said, needs analysis is where it all begins in ESP. And so anybody doing ESP, anybody doing business English will be familiar with these sorts of things. We'll probably do some sort of a genre analysis. So what sort of text types are people using in the target discourse? And we'll be looking at specific lexis, specific grammatical features, perhaps a load of different things. But we're trying to analyze and teach the language of a particular discipline or of a particular workplace context or a particular industry or whatever the needs analysis is. And I'm sure we're all familiar with words like this, you know, the difference between a narrow angle course and a wide angle course. A narrow angle is very, very focused. English for accountants who work at a particular company with a particular client, and wide angle would be just financial English or English for accountants, much, much more general than a narrow angle approach. We often talk about things like authenticity, the idea that our materials and how people interact with these materials have to be authentic, have to have some sort of relationship to the real world. We talk about specificity, English for specific purposes, you know, trying to make things as specific, as focused as possible. We are very familiar in our business with trying to create tasks for our students, for our learners, which are related to real life situations. This is fairly standard stuff in ESP. And of course, as we're teaching, especially as we're teaching adults, learner autonomy, in other words, giving the learner the responsibility for learning, and not the teacher, and giving the learner the reins and letting them go with it, that's very much part of an ESP adult language teaching approach. So this is where we are with ESP. Let's look now at a real, I haven't been moving the slides, have I? I've been moving the slides on the wrong screen, I'm so sorry. Oh gosh.
Oh, it was okay. Everything seemed to be okay. They go.
Were the slides moving while I was speaking?
You were on the
anyway,
right
okay.
side.
They
Yes.
are now.
So it was coherent. What you were talking about was on the slide.
Exactly. Okay. So now what we're going to look at is the maritime industry. Some examples from where I work. This is in South Korea. And I've been going there for the last, I don't know, since 2016, 2017, something like that, interrupted only by COVID. And what I've been working in, the maritime industry is huge. It's absolutely vast. You know, there's nearly 100,000 ships going around the sea at any one time. But I've been working in something called the Vessel Traffic Service. And these are the people who, like air traffic control, sit there and guide these vessels in and out of very busy harbors, put them in anchorages, and so on. So very much focused on one very specific part of the maritime industry. And this is the sort of thing they will be doing. They'll be giving information to vessels. So, for example, they will say the blue is the sea, okay, and the green is the land. And you have these motor vessels, MV, motor vessel. So information, motor vessel Anna, 3 nautical miles west of you, proceeding northeast to Belth, Juliet. So you can see this is information which vessels might need, but you can also see that it's already very specific type of language, which is related to maritime English, related to the context. Question, what is your ETA at the pilot station? Estimated time of arrival at the pilot station. What is a pilot station? Well, that's something you'd know if you were in maritime English. Information, pilot board on station, wind north 5 meters per second. Request, rig pilot lander port side 2 meters above water. So these are the sorts of things that people are talking about when they're interacting with a VTS. Now, what we did, or what I was involved in, what the team at KIMFT in South Korea did, was they collected and made a big corpus. This was 360 of these conversations between the VTS, the Vessel Traffic Service, and the vessels. And what we were trying to do is analyze, or what the team was trying to do is analyze these conversations in order to make the teaching better, in order to help reduce miscommunication when these people speak. Now, you have to think about the situation. The VTS operators are, in this case, mostly Korean. Well, they're all Korean, but the vessels coming in can come from anywhere in the world. And so very often the language is English. If it's not Korean, it's going to be English. So what we have is something called the IMO SMCP, Standard Maritime Communication, Standard Marine Communication Phrases. And these are guidelines of what you should and shouldn't say. But of course, they're guidelines. There's no strict, it's not as strict as air traffic control. There is some flexibility. So one of the things we were looking at is looking at these conversations and then comparing them to the standard phraseology to see how much people actually use the standards in real life. And this is a book which everybody has, and everybody on a vessel or in a VTS is familiar with the contents. And here you can see these are the high frequency words. So the top 10 is SN, which is ship's name. Second is VTS, of course, because every time there's a radio conversation, they say where they're speaking from. And then it's you, is, anchor, over, okay, and so on. So these are the most common words. Then you have sir, position, I, thank, degrees, and so on. And go on and go on and go on. I'll be looking at one or two of these in a bit more detail. If you look in the first column, the first sort of maritime word after VTS is anchor. So we'll look at a couple of selections of using this word anchor. And then I'll look at the last word, the 30th word here, which is copy. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So here are some typical anchor requests from a vessel speaking to the VTS. Could you please give me anchor position? Please give me anchor position. Please give me position somewhere in Echo 3. I request drop anchor area. Please give me anchorage, okay? Please give us anchor position. Over. I want to confirm my anchor position. No difficulty there. Pretty standard English. You can see some variety. People are asking roughly the same thing in slightly different ways, and that's fine. No problem at all. But here are some more sentences or utterances with the word anchor. We are dropped anchor because bad weather. Good morning, where drop anchor? My drop anchor time 2050 local time. I'd like to heave up my anchor and reposition my anchor because now my anchor is stretching. I finally anchor away, over. Now, none of these cause miscommunication. There's no problem here. The VTS understands what's being requested. And if they don't, they can ask. But here, there's no problem at all understanding anything that's going on. Yet traditional English teachers would correct a lot of these things because the grammar is not quite standard grammar that we might have done in our exams or in our course books. And this is where we already begin to see how English as a lingua franca in the workplace is being used and how it's much more flexible than perhaps some of the English we focus on when we're doing testing and traditional English teaching. Here are some more conversations, this time with copy. So the first one is VTS says, your cargo is crap. That is correct, crap. And the vessel answers, scrap. Sierra, Charlie, Romeo, Alpha, Papa. Ah, scrap, says the VTS. Copy your message. Thank you for your cooperation. Now here, copy seems to mean I understand. Ah, scrap, copy your message. The interesting thing is that copy does not appear in these guidelines, in these SMCP. They're not supposed to be using it, and yet it's a very, very high frequency term. Look at the second one. The VTS says, I give you anchor position, over. You give anchor position. Yeah, that's correct. Are you ready to copy, over? Yeah, you give anchor position, I will write it. So maybe here, copy has a meaning of write rather than understand. Here's another one. Yes, this is the city, VTS. Copy, I will give you anchor position. Let it copy, anchor position. Yes, correct. What does copy mean here? VTS, ship's name, go ahead. VTS, I will give you anchor position and copy. Copy, copy, says the VTS. So you begin to see these people seem to know what's going on. But it's quite a flexible use of this word copy. We don't really understand exactly what they mean, but the conversations seem to be working. Here's another situation. Very often when people are coming in, they refer to local landmarks when they're talking about anchorages and so on. I'm sure most of us in this audience can read this, but just in case you can't read Korean, what we're talking about is a lighthouse at the end of right at the end of the land there, and it's called Gwamju Lighthouse. I'm not sure my pronunciation is very good, but that's what it is. Now, imagine you're a vessel coming in from somewhere in the world, maybe from, I don't know, Russia or from Chile or from America or whatever. You've never heard of Gwamju Lighthouse, and you might not be able to understand the local pronunciation of it. This is a sort of conversation you get. Could you please give me anchor position? Give me anchor position, over. Okay, I'll give you anchoring position. Ship's name, please ready to write down. Yes, I'm ready, I'm ready. Gwamju Lighthouse bearing 195 degrees, distance 1 nautical mile. Pardon, pardon. Ship's name, stand by, I'll call you back. Stand by, yes, stand by, stand by. So there's a problem here, not because of the standard English and so on, but because the vessel didn't understand Gwamju as a thing. You know, it's just the name of a local lighthouse. And you just don't know what it is if you don't know the area. And so they will call back when they've got some other way of giving the details. So what we've got in these classes, training these VTS operators, VTSOs, they're called VTSOs, there's a lot of radio practice, and they're practicing the standard phraseology in that book, the guidelines, and they're also working on their English grammar and lots and lots and lots of role plays. So conversations which replicate these sorts of conversations, and there's no problem at all there. The problem, however, is that these people actually, the anchoring or the, you know, where is the anchor and so on, those aren't urgent, those aren't problematic. There's time. But when there's an emergency, a fire perhaps, or a complex situation which has to be resolved, that's the difficult things these people have to deal with in the real situation. And that's very hard to actually practice and train for, because every situation is unique. And so, you know, the corpus gives us lots and lots of standard stuff, but actually what we need as trainers, as well as standard stuff, is lots of complex situations. And we don't get those because they're rare. The way they do it in this area, in this training center, is they bring in experienced VTSOs. So you've got the learners there, you can see them, the young men. Sometimes it isn't always men, but this photo seems I've only men. So experienced VTSOs, plus these learners, plus a Korean-speaking English teacher. And together, what they do is they sit down and they talk in Korean about possible emergencies. The experienced operators will talk about emergencies they had to deal with in the past. And then together they will create and put together conversations which might have worked in English to solve that particular problem. In other words, they make up the conversations as a group in order to do it, because there are no standard conversations which they can just go away and learn. So they're having to react and deal with these situations. What we're talking about in ESP is very much this climb, English for the workplace to English for their workplace. This, when I first came across this phrase, 20, 30 years ago, I guess, this was really the biggest insight for me. It's not the workplace that we're teaching for, it's their workplace. That's what needs analysis means. It means really understanding what it is they need to do. And this is, of course, the biggest difficulty if you're teaching ESP in a university situation, where you are normally working with disciplinary language. So you're talking about English for engineers or English for accountants or English for economics or something like that. When people go into the real workplace, they're not talking about English for economics. They're talking about English for a meeting to discuss problems about economics, perhaps with the clients, and so on. So the language for their workplace is very different to the discipline that we're focused on very often in pre-experience classes. And it's this focus with trying always to get from the workplace to their workplace. So that's what ESP is, I think. Now, let's go back to Maritime. We're going to stop Maritime in a minute. Just one last comment. If you go into any one of these big vessels, what you find is it's not only that the vessel is coming into a foreign port and having to deal with the VTS in English, but the reality on board is that you have all sorts of people from all sorts of different parts of the world. And these people come together perhaps for 1 or 2 voyages, maybe for a couple of months, and then they will disappear and new crews come on. So you might have the vessel might be registered in the USA, the owner might be Japanese, it might be managed by a South Korean company, the officers might come from Norway, the crew might come from Indonesia or the Philippines. Insurance is done by somebody in UK, and the cargo is from China and India and Singapore. And so you can see that even on board, every one of these vessels, as soon as these people come together, they're using English as a lingua franca. This is not beautiful English to pass tests. This is not beautiful English because everybody's been to school for years and years and years. They're using English to do their job, and it's a tool. And that's really what English as a lingua franca is. So let's move into a definition now of what we mean by ELF. This is one of the definitions. There are slight variations, but this one will do for us today. Any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often the only option. Any use of English among speakers of different first languages. So a native English speaker speaking to somebody from China in English is also using ELF. And that's where it starts getting very interesting, because the native English speaker is now speaking something which is not standard English. It's not the native speaker type of English, variety of English. It's something else. And there's plenty of research which shows how native speakers also have to adapt for this international situation. It's not the rest of the world has to conform to native speakers. Together, they have to both what's called accommodate, adjust their speech in order to communicate together or with each other. Now, I mentioned that ELF and Belth has been changing, and that in my previous talk I did completely different articles. Jennifer Jenkins, one of the big researchers in ELF, identified 3 phases of ELF research, and maybe there's another phase coming along. But what the beautiful thing about ELF research is that as people do research and collect evidence, they change their minds about what is happening and what is important. In other words, ELF and Belth research is looking at the evidence of what really happens. It's not some sort of theory and we have to force everything to fit the theory. It keeps changing as people deepen their understanding and learn and understand different perspectives. So in the beginning, in the 90s, I guess, ELF was really a focus on forms. People were trying to understand the form of the language. So how words were pronounced, for example, how words are spelt. And what they were trying to do is say, okay, there's lots of different varieties of English in the world, Singaporean English, Indian English, and so on. Perhaps we can codify these different varieties. Perhaps we can say, identify some sort of core which everybody uses. So TH, is it necessary? Is it not necessary? Now, very soon, they gathered a lot of evidence, a lot of research, a lot of data. Very soon they found that actually you can't. It's too complex to identify and codify varieties because everything is changing all the time. And so we move into what Jenkins then calls the second phase, where language is much more variable. You can't put language in a box and say this is Indian English and this is Singaporean English, because what they were finding is that how people use ELF is that it adjusts across these varieties. So when an Indian speaks to somebody from Singapore, maybe they'll both change the language a little bit. So it changes according to context. ELF is context specific. It's not something which we can identify and pin down and say, this is ELF. So this is one of the important things about ELF, and something which sometimes people get mixed up. There is something called World Englishes, which tries and looks at different Englishes around the world. Singaporean English, Indian English, British English, Manchester English, and so on. And then there's ELF, which says, it's much more complex than that. And as people meet from these different parts of the world and different cultures and so on, they change the way they speak. It's variable. So that was the second big insight, and that came maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. And then over the last 10 years or so, people have been talking much more about multilingualism. So now what people are seeing in the data, seeing in the evidence, seeing in all these recordings and all these corpora that they're building up, is that almost in every conversation, English is never alone. There's always other languages coming in and influencing, and people speak in different languages. Now, I'm not talking about code switching where people just swap and use one word from the other. It's a bit more complex than that. But when you go into a bank, for example, in Italy, which is near the border with France, you'll find that people are speaking a mixture. It's multilingual. It's no longer clearly English, because everybody in the conversation can use the different languages. And so what the ELF researchers are now finding is that English is only one of many languages which people are looking at. And this, of course, is a big challenge for us as teachers if we're teaching English, because the reality is we can teach English as much as we want. As soon as we go into the workplace, people are doing something else. So there's this major departure, she says, from this monolingual bias of most non-critical second language acquisition, ELT, even applied linguists. So in the traditional world of what we've been looking at, we've been talking about English. ELF is saying we can no longer talk about English because that's not actually what's happening in the real world. It's not as simple as saying English or another language. There's a lot more going on in how people talk in these international contexts. Let's talk a little bit about business now, because that's where we are. So we've talked about ELF, the general idea, the basic idea of English as a lingua franca. English as a business lingua franca is really just ELF in a business context. How you define business? Well, there's lots of debate about that. Some people like to prefer to see business English as more to do with commerce and trade. Others say, well, it's anything to do with industry. So it could be the language of engineering, the language of accountancy, the language of whatever. But however you define it, research over and over again gets these sorts of comments from the people in the companies who are actually using English. They say things like this: conformity with standard English is seen as a fairly irrelevant concept. So there's this comparison again with this native speaker standard, whatever standard is. Nobody knows what standard is. But what they're saying in the real world is that it's irrelevant. What's more important is that people communicate. I don't actually care whether something is correct or incorrect, as long as the meaning is not distorted. So what they're saying when you speak to these managers, this one comes from a German multinational corporation, is the language isn't important as long as we can understand each other. English is a tool. It's not a thing in itself. It's not because I want to pass a test. In the real world, English is for something else. There are lots of, let's say, gurus in this world. These two are very, very well known in Belth research. Lukiala Salminen and Anna Kanranta. These are up in Finland. And they came up a few years ago now with this whole idea of what do we mean by communicative competence in this business world, in this industrial world. And what they're saying is that it consists of many, many layers. Of course, you need to know business know-how. That's absolutely key. And that's really interesting because in our world of ELT, everybody's talking about soft skills, about as if they solve all the problems. Soft skills don't do anything if you don't know how to be an accountant, if you don't know how to be an engineer. So you've got to have the hard skills as much as the soft skills. Then they talk about this competence in Belth, and on the right you can see how they've listed Belth competence. They say you've got to have some sort of English core, although this is not easily defined, but you've got to have a core of shared English, otherwise it's very difficult to communicate at all. You've got to be able to understand and use and be familiar with the specific genres in your business. And to know genres doesn't only mean understanding how the text works, but knowing how flexible you can be. In other words, it's not a fixed thing. And then most importantly, and this is coming out in many, many articles, as we'll see, communication strategies. It's not about the language necessarily. It's about the strategies people use in order to interact with each other. Here they've listed clarity, brevity, directness, and politeness. But there are many, many other communication strategies. For example, redundancy is an interesting one. Good international communicators use the same words over and over again and explain things again and again, which you wouldn't to somebody else, say an English person speaking to an English. You would assume that they know you, they know what you're saying. But the redundancy as a communication strategy means that person might not have understood. Let me just clarify, let me just explain, let me just say it in other words, and so on. And so it's these sorts of communication strategies which we see very often in the research on what makes a successful Belth user. So what is Belth? Let's define it. A Belth is perceived as an enabling resource to get the work done, an enabling resource. It's a tool, nothing else. Since it is highly context-bound and situation-specific, remember those maritime things, nobody else in the world will be having those discussions about anchors. But since it is highly bound and situation-specific, it is a moving target, defying detailed linguistic description. We can't pin it down. But isn't that exactly what ESP is trying to do? ESP is trying to say, yeah, we can recognize the genres, we can recognize the lexis, we can recognize the grammar of a discipline and help people understand it and use it in the real world. What ELF and Belth researchers are saying is it's not quite as simple as that because it's not fixed. It's very context specific, very situation specific, and it's moving all the time. So what works is what works in the real world. It's not what works because somebody says it's correct or incorrect. It doesn't have to meet a standard, a theoretical standard. It has to work in order to be successful. Here's another definition of Belth. This is a more recent one. Belth is the use of English as the medium of communication between speakers of different first languages. We've seen that already. Now look, these are the next three words which are so important. In an emergent, variable, and hybrid manner. Emergent. The language comes from the situation and from the people involved. It varies. There's no standard. There's no right or wrong. And it's hybrid. It pulls in things from many different places. The point is, it's appropriate to the demands and, as it says here, multilingual resources of the specific business context. We keep hearing this word specific. This is what we're working on. Now, here's the question. Is this the sort of communication you practice in your classroom? Are you encouraging people to have emergent, variable, and hybrid English? Are you encouraging people to be multilingual? Are you focusing on specific business contexts? because that's what people actually need to do when they get into the real world, when they leave your classroom and move out. Otherwise, we're doing something in the classroom which isn't quite there. Now, we can discuss this for hours, I know, because there's got to be some compromise. But this is quite interesting when you start thinking about it in this terms. If this is what people are doing in the workplace, then surely that's what we should be preparing them for in the classroom, perhaps. Here's another comment about Belth communication. This is from Alessia Kogo and Jana Prasad. We'll look at her article later in a bit more detail. But they point out, and many people are saying the same thing, Belth communication is intrinsically intercultural. And for that, business professionals need to be able to deal not only with multiple backgrounds and identities, but also with different ways of operating, acting in multiple business cultures. So we're not talking about culture in terms of British culture or German culture or Polish culture. We're talking about culture in the sense of people who do things in a different way. You know, engineers from different companies work in different ways. Engineers are very different to lawyers, so professional cultures, national cultures, age, people of different ages are different, and so on. Now, here's the next question. If we're preparing people to deal with intercultural communication, can we do this in a room where everybody comes from the same culture and background? Or should we be putting them into the sorts of groups and teams that they're going to really meet in the real world? And if we should be doing that, then how do we do that? In a company, it's easy. We often have, especially with Zoom, we have people in classes from all over the world. But face-to-face training tends to be mostly, not entirely, people from one culture and one background. We're missing the point about teaching them how to operate if we do that. So Belth is evolving. It used to be called Belth. It's now called English as a Business Lingua Franca. And one of the reasons for that is the focus was not on something called business English, as if it's something, as if it's an identifiable variety. What they're trying to say is, yes, we're talking about English within the business context. It's not one thing. It changes depending on the context, depending on the situation. And as I mentioned earlier, some people aren't even calling it Belth anymore. They're calling it Wealth. I'm not sure if this is going to take off. Belth has been around for many years. But in some ways, workplace English makes more sense than business context, because business seems to be defined as a sort of narrower set than workplace. It all depends how you define these things. Let's look at testing and assessment. Now, we talked about how variable and how it changes according to context. So it makes no sense to focus on specific forms. In other words, the only thing that is testable is the outcome. What Jenkins is saying here in quite a recent article, and this is quite an extreme view in some ways, is to say we can't test the language itself. What we can test is we give them a task and we see if they've successfully completed the task. That's the only test. In other words, we're looking at task-based assessment rather than the traditional language. You know, is the grammar form correct? Is the spelling correct? Have they put the word order quite in the right order according to some theoretical standard and so on? Difficult. IELTS, maybe you've come across IELTS, big international test, offered at over 900 locations around the world. 9,000 organizations globally are using it. This is off their website. And look at this. Test questions are developed by specialists in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and US, making it a truly international test. Those are Jenkins italics. It's not international. It's developed by specialists who happen to have grown up speaking English in their own language, in their own countries. International English is much bigger than these 4 or 5 countries. You know, Chinese English or China English, however you want to call it, is probably the largest single variety of English now in the world. Where are they here? You know, half the companies in the world come from China and India. Where are they in these question design teams and so on? So you can see the sorts of problems and the sorts of questions that ELF and Belth researchers are asking. This is TOEIC. TOEIC is probably the biggest, well-known, best-known business English test. There's a growing need to expand TOEIC constructs, so what they're working on in the test, to fit the real world language demands of international workplace contexts. It's such a general test that it doesn't actually prove anything in terms of when you go into a local context. Perhaps we can't have these big general tests. Perhaps we do have to go for something more specific, something more task-based in future. Very difficult, very expensive. Nobody really knows how to do that. It's happening already in health. It's happening already in aviation, a little bit in maritime, but you know, very, very difficult to do in reality. Another one of the words you'll hear in Belth is translanguaging. And this is this idea that when people come together, because most of us speak more than one language, it's only very, very, very few people in the world who only speak one language. And you're using multiple languages in order to communicate. And in this research, the multinational company, MNC, adopts English as its common corporate language. So the official language is English, but employees mix the languages to establish a space where they can talk, where they can accommodate their needs. In other words, you can say all you like from the top, everybody must speak English. The reality is it's always going to be this mixture. There's somebody in this study, and he says, I can't recall the translanguaging practice. I can't recall when I kept swapping languages. I think I didn't change my language on purpose. I'm just uttering the words that come to mind. For example, I might say team, localization. Our team is doing great in localization. I'm not going to attempt the Chinese. I don't mean to use English words on purpose. I'm just used to it. That's how everyone talks. And so this is now becoming completely natural. And I'm sure you can think of many examples from your own use when speaking perhaps Polish, if you're from Poland or wherever you're from in the world. And English words just pop in and out, maybe other language, French or Spanish words pop in and out. Eventually they become part of the language perhaps, but that's how it all works in reality. It's not pure, it's not unchanging. Translanguaging, this whole idea sees language as a process, not a fixed product. So it's challenging this idea that language have clear boundaries. We cannot say this is English, this is Italian, this is French. You know, what is pizza? Is pizza Italian? Is it French? Is it English? It affords opportunities, this translanguaging, for learners to bring in their own identity. In other words, what we're trying to do here is not say you must speak British English because you're a foreigner. Otherwise, you're failing in some way. It's much more complex than that, much more complicated. And it's challenging this whole idea that we can even talk about standards. What is standard English? Nobody knows. You know, you have to have a test, so you create your own standard. And of course, people will argue, yes, we need the same standards, otherwise we won't understand each other. Well, the ELF research is saying something else. They're saying people find a way to understand each other. Maybe these standards are not as critical as we once thought. Target language. ESP is all about identifying the target language. Can we identify it, or is it changing so much? Is it so context specific? Difficult. We're also talking about this change from how we see culture. In the old days, when I started a few 100 years ago, we talked about cross-cultural training. This idea that Japanese do things one way, Germans do this way, and we compare. And then people started talking about intercultural training, and intercultural talks about how the different cultures interact with each other. So you have the Japanese and the French, and they talk to each other, and that's intercultural communication. So you're not comparing the cultures, you're saying, how do they interact? And now we're talking about transcultural, and transcultural is much more about how the cultures actually change and adapt as they come together. In intercultural, you're still saying these cultures are different and we can identify them. In transcultural, what we're saying now is it's not fixed boundaries. We cannot identify these things so simply. We can talk about how people learn in the workplace. Learning seems to happen most effectively in business communities of practice rather than in traditional English training. People aren't learning business English in classes because we don't teach them the right stuff. They're learning on the job. Takino, we'll be looking at this later. I illustrated how heavily their learning was sourced from their own experience of using English at work rather than from a systematic study of English. Yeah. Are we doing the right thing, guys? This is the challenge. This is what this research is beginning to suggest, I think. So I'm going to very quickly go through some recent articles just to give you a flavor. If you want to read these, you'll have to download them, access them yourself. Obviously, we're not going to have time to go to them in any great detail. So I'm going to flick through this. You can go through the video later to see my summaries. But I'm just going to mention one or two things which I think are of interest. So here are the journal articles I'm going to comment on. The first one is by Kanta Batra. This is a PhD study, and what he's looking at is Thai business professionals from 3 different companies in Thailand and how these people interact with people from other Asian countries. He's focusing on the strategies they use to communicate. And there's lots of conversation analysis, 9 hours of meetings, and then lots of interviews. These are the sorts of findings, and I'm not going to read all these. You'll have to come back and look at them later if you want to look at the details. But I'll just pick out 1 or 2. Look at the first one. Unlike native speaker interactions, participants cannot take understanding for granted. Constant process of negotiation of meaning. This is this stuff I was talking about with redundancy earlier. You cannot just, because you use the word contract, you cannot assume that the other person understands contract in the same way as you. And so good speakers of Belth, good competent speakers, are continually having to define and clarify and repeat and so on. Otherwise, you have conversations where one group is talking about one thing and the other group is talking about another thing, but they think they're talking about the same thing. And look down at the bottom, the last comment. It says, most meetings shaped and determined by time constraints. So what they identified in this research was that actually it wasn't the language that was the problem. It was the fact that they didn't have enough time to finish the work because there was too much stress. People had to get on planes and fly home. You know, so we always have to remember that there's a context this is all happening in. It's not as simple as thinking about it in terms of language. This is a very interesting, Otsu looked at small talk. Now, small talk is difficult, especially when people meet for the first time. How do you say to somebody, you're going to meet that person for the first time, please record yourself? This research managed it. There are 2 people sitting in a car on the way to a construction site, and they got permission to record, which is fantastic. So you've got a Japanese architect and a Malaysian hotel employee. They don't know each other. They're meeting for the first time in the car. And the focus is basically trying to understand how this finding common ground, how does this small talk work? And there's some technical stuff in it as well. But what's interesting is, as other people have found, what people talk about, the topic choice, is influenced by power and role relationship. So you don't talk about the weather just because you talk about the weather. Here, the architect is the senior person, and that's what decides what people talk about. In business English, one of the definitions of business English is there's normally this difference in power between people in the conversation. They're not equal status. And look at the bottom. This is what we've seen before. The content of the conversation is prioritized over correct forms or native speaker norms. They're not worried about speaking correct English. They're not worried about native speaker English. They're focused on the content. In other words, what they're talking about, not how they're talking about it. Nielsen, this is up in Norway. I say up because I'm in Germany, so it's up from here. And these are multinational corporations, oil and gas, lots of interviews again. And this is just looking at how Belth is happening in these contexts. As you found, of course, English is widely used, surprise, surprise, perhaps, for many of us. But here, there's a slightly different emphasis. Look at the second line. The focus is on getting the job done, yes. But there is some concern that less correct language could cause a bad impression. In other words, people here, perhaps Norway is a country where a lot of people speak pretty good English, and so they're worried that bad English is going to send the wrong signal in the business context. And so some of the people in these interviews said, well, actually, no, I do want to speak correct English. And we find this very, very often all around the world. ELF and Belth research is not at all saying you don't have to worry about grammar and correct English. Absolutely not. What it's saying is it's context specific, and what is appropriate and correct in a certain situation might be completely different in another situation. That's not the same as saying we don't agree with grammar. Look at the fourth one down. Use of company speak common. Company speak is a term used to describe language which companies have. And so, for example, a car company in, I don't know, in the south of Germany and a car company in Taiwan, they might be making very similar products, but they will talk about these products in quite different ways. And so part of the problem, if you're going to go into automotive engineering and you go into a company, is learning how that company speaks and talks about products and talks about engineering, talks about concepts. This, again, is a challenge for anybody teaching in a university, because those people who are learning English for automotive engineering are going to go into the companies and find that people in those companies use these terms in quite different ways. I saw this myself. I was working in a German company, gas turbine company. It bought an American gas turbine company. They merged together and they both made gas turbines and they didn't speak the same language at all. Simple things had different names. This is Miyuki Takino. This is how to become a Belth user. In other words, how do people actually do it in the workplace? How do people learn English for the workplace? Fascinating article. This is one of my favorite articles. I quote her all the time. So these are Japanese business professionals. She interviewed lots of people and she was trying to find out, how do people become Belth users? So how do they go from being learners in the classroom, maybe at school and so on, to actually using English in the workplace? And what she found is really interesting, I think. The process requires novice Belth users to unlearn norms learned at school. They learned the wrong things at school and relearn new norms in a Belth context. Most participants remain frustrated with their English. Stretching experiences of English use play a central role in forcing participants to develop Belth competence. In other words, putting them into the situation and making them use their English and forcing them to do it, stretching their use in a real situation. Learning mainly facilitated by experience of using English. The initial stage is most difficult. Users require a change of attitude. Learning process is continuous and dynamic. It never stops. And this is interesting, the last comment, learning from experience needs to be supplemented by study. So perhaps what we need to be doing is watching what people are doing in the workplace and then coaching on the side, helping them, but being fully aware of where they are in the workplace and what they're struggling with. Not saying, okay, we're going to do chapter 1 of this textbook today because I'm the English teacher. So maybe we have to find a way of teaching which is much more in touch with what people are actually doing. That means going into the companies, that means observing, that means recording, that means speaking to the other interactants, all sorts of analysis to find out where the problems are so that you can help them. Very different to taking them totally out of context and teaching them business English. Kogo and Jana Prasad, I mentioned this earlier, they looked at two European banks, a Swiss bank and an Italian bank, and they wanted to see how people thought about English, so the language ideology. Again, interviews, and what they found is English is not the only language used. Surprise, surprise, they use other languages too. When it is used as a lingua franca, so not between native speakers, but as a lingua franca, it is always a multilingual mode of communication. They don't speak it without having Italian words and French words or Swiss words or German words. And contrary to the still dominant overall discourses, i.e. what we're teaching, communication can only be managed and be efficient if we only speak one language at a time. The real life is mixed, fluid, translingual use of Belth can be observed in both banks. So this research actually says we can say all we want about they must speak English. They're just not doing it in the real world. Kanranta and their team looking at corporate English as a corporate language again in multilingual or multinational corporations. Again, lots of surveys and interviews. And they use the Kaufman metaphor. You may know Kaufman came up in the 50s, came up with this very nice idea that there's front stage and backstage communication. Front stage, like in a theater, you put on an act, you put on a show. Backstage, you're more relaxed. You're talking to your fellow professionals, your friends, and so on, you're using a different sort of language. This Kaufman metaphor is used everywhere now in business English type discussions, and they used it in this to talk about this idea of the official language, the top down. The boss says we must use this, it's English, compared to the backstage, which is the real language people are using, the working language, and how it's actually quite different. It's not only English. Corporate language, top down, standard English, native speaker is the standard we have to stick to. It's a gatekeeper, which means if you can't speak it, you can't get into this senior part of the company. The working language, the language people use throughout the company, English is the tool to get the work done. And it's situation specific, it's emergent, it's multilingual, it's got this mixture with professional expertise. In other words, it's not going to be just English, because that's not how people actually communicate. Last one, VTSOs. VTSOs looked at business English materials, course books, and said, yeah, let's look at course books and see how much they're focused on the communication strategies, which we've been talking about in ELF and Belth now for 10, 15, 20 years. So she's looking at different communication strategies. Are we teaching these things? Are we focusing on this global communicative competence model, that blue circles I showed you earlier? Are we looking at that stuff when we teach business English in our course books? And what she finds, of course, surprise, surprise, ELT materials do not deal consistently with strategies. And even when examples are provided, they're rarely accompanied by reflection tasks. In other words, building awareness and so on. Belth is there, people are aware of it, but it's not consistently dealt with, she said. GCC is not hardly ever dealt with as an overall thing. It's always done separately. And she couldn't find any example in 15 books on people using these different languages, plurilingual strategies and so on, which, as many, many researchers, just about all the ones we've seen have shown, we're talking about multilingual situations when we talk about real Belth use. So, pretty much the last slide. What are the implications of all this? Personally, I think the traditional ESP approaches are useful, but they are not addressing this new world which we're discovering and which we're researching and which we have a lot of evidence for. There's lots of new insights for us as ELT practitioners, and it's based on evidence. It's not based on intuition. It's not based on, well, yeah, this is how they should be doing it in the company. The fact is, that's not how they're doing it in the company. It's our job to know this stuff. Belth research is incremental. In other words, it's growing bit by bit. It is continually evolving and changing. So we need to keep up with it. You know, I came up to somebody last week at a conference and she said, oh, ELF is dead. And I said, have you read any of the recent stuff in the last 2 or 3 years? She didn't even know about translanguaging. She didn't even know about multilingual research and all this stuff. She just assumed it was the stuff she'd read in the 90s and that was now finished and nobody was talking about it anymore. Yeah, I'm nearly done, Lucina. Testing and publishing. We, as practitioners, have to put pressure on these people to produce tests, to produce books which really reflect this evidence rather than do the same old thing because it's easier. Our job is getting more challenging for sure. As we find out how people really use English in the workplace, it's getting harder and harder. If you're interested in Belth, some of us have formed a group and we meet once a month, once every few weeks. You can go into this website and find out all about it. And it's just teachers, actually, funnily enough, it's from all over the world. We meet people from Mexico, from Africa, from China, and they all come together. Every time it's slightly different people, and we have great discussions about how people are doing this in class and how to learn from each other. So it's a fairly small group, 20, 30 people normally. It started off even smaller, but it's been going about a year. Lots of resources on the website. If you're interested, you can just go into that website and download. And there's always summaries of what we did last time, so you can see the sorts of things. Sometimes we have a well-known researcher come in and talk about their research. Sometimes we just pull out a theme and just throw it out there and everybody comments on it. Sometimes the conversations are awful. Sometimes they're fantastic. It's hit and miss, but it's actually a fun group. So that brings me to the end of this very fast run through Belth, English as a Business Lingua Franca. I know it was fast. You can go through these slides again in your own time. Certainly, I recommend, if you're interested in this, go into some of these articles. And there are many, many more articles. I just picked a small handful to give you a flavor of the sorts of things people are using. If you're interested in teaching business English, if you're teaching professionals how to use English in the workplace, I would argue clearly you need to know this stuff. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions or if we've got time for questions. I haven't been following chat. Lucina?
I have been following chat as well, and I have found many positive comments. Such a pleasant experience of listening to or learning something useful. Thanks a lot. Yes, it's so useful. You know, if I were to reflect on what you have inspired us with tonight, is that we need to stay together. Yes, because there are so many new things happening all around the world, and also I never feel like a wise guy anymore.
No.
Yes, I learn from my students. I continue learning from my students, and believe me, I am really very, very inspired by many of them. Yes, so this process
Totally
of
agree.
teaching is more process of learning for us as well. Yes, and so we have to be modest. We shouldn't pretend to know, to have the keys to the doors. Yes,
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely right. We are not the experts. We can never be the experts, but we need to look at the evidence. We need to be aware of what's going on. You know?
And be inspired by people like you. Yes.
Well, I don't know about that. I'm inspired by all these researchers I'm reading, because I really think this stuff, if you're into business English, is really gold. You know, it's giving us so many interesting ways of thinking about what I've been doing for the last 30 years. And it's an interesting world we live in, for sure. Yeah. Has anybody got any questions?
No questions, but a lot to reflect.
It's a bit late, I know.
Maybe I see that Tomek Doda has visualized himself, so maybe he has something to say.
Hello for everyone, and I'd like to say thank you for the best and the perfect speech today. Because what I'd like to say, how many words we must to know to use the English? Because I'm not an English teacher, I'm a technician veterinarian subject, in my school, but I have, my idea is 1 word per day, and for example, when I start in the classes, at the first, I write on a table 1 word in English,
Sure.
And how many words is it possible talking of English language?
Nobody can answer that question, because of course there are so many words which have more than one meaning. You know, some words have 10, 15, 20, 25 meanings depending on the context. So there's no answer. There's no possible way any of us, and this room is full of experienced teachers. But I would say it's not about words. I would say it's about lexis, which is groups of words. So if you learn words with other words, which it's a good question, but there's no answer. Sorry.
I know. Thank you very much.
You just wanted to challenge us, and you've managed.
No, I know. He knew what I was going to say.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. If there are no other questions, now it's time to reflect. I've been taking my screenshots of all those relevant materials, and I'm going to reflect on them as well. Yes, so I feel inspired. I feel ready for reflection. So thank you very much for this.
You're very welcome. A lot of people are talking about this stuff. You know, come to the BSIC conference or IATEFL Poland conference. You'll get talks on this stuff. It's current. You know, this is the research